This session will be led by Dr. Archana Kumari, Associate Professor, Department of English, Central University of South.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible to you all?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So, I am thankful to Dr. Regine Silvest, the President of Cape Comorin Trust, Tamil Nadu, for giving me this opportunity to chair a technical session in this 3-day international webinar, international virtual conference on the Fourth World Literature. So, in this technical session, there are 6 presenters, and all the presenters are from India. Okay, so the first, I hope all the presenters are present here. So I would like to call upon the first presenter, Mrs. Bipasa Majumdar. She is from Debra TSKS Mahavidyalaya, Vidyasagar University, West Bengal. And topic is Arundhati Roy's The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, Geocritical Exploration. Over to Mrs. Bipasa Majumdar.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. I am going to present my paper. The title of my paper you have gone through. Arundhati Roy's The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, Geocritical Exploration. I am going to present, ma'am.
Yeah, you can start. Are you sharing your PPT?
It's PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. It is visible.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. So the title of my paper is Arundhati Roy's The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, a Geocritical Exploration. The objectives of today's discussion are to learn what geocriticism is, to know when geocriticism emerged and why, and then to interpret Arundhati Roy's The Ministry of Utmost Happiness from the perspective of geocriticism. Now you know Arundhati Roy is a distinguished figure in the contemporary Indian English fiction, who exploded on the literary scene with her Booker Prize-winning novel The God of Small Things. And The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, Our Present Concern, is her second novel, which was published in the year 2017. Although the literary world had to wait 2 decades for it, there is no doubt that The Ministry of Utmost Happiness proves worth the wait. Once again, Roy, a dynamic social, political, and environmental activist, has presented a kaleidoscopic picture of contemporary India encompassing numerous significant issues, as in her debut novel, The God of Small Things. In fact, all of her works, fiction as well as non-fiction, are reflective of her anger towards injustice, be it social, political, and environmental. Let us recall what Arundhati Roy said in an interview with Kathy Arlen Sokol. I quote, "In everything I do or have ever done in my life, I feel anger towards authority. I'm not at all calm about major issues or major questions, you know. And that's not a sort of shouting kind of anger that I have, but a very cold anger." Unquote. Now, my endeavor in this paper is to revisit Roy's latest novel from the perspective of geocriticism, in order to show how the ecocentric values of collective ethical responsibility and the claims of the animal community beyond ourselves receive an adorable expression in this novel. Now, the first question that naturally arises is what geocriticism is. Geocriticism is one of the fastest growing subfields within eco-critical literary studies. It is concerned with how the relationship between human beings and animals gets reflected in literature. However, we should remember that Jew criticism is more than simply the study of animals represented in literary works. I am going to quote Graham Coogan and Helen Tipping's Post-Colonial Eco-Criticism, page number 18. I quote, "Zoo criticism, as we might term its practice in literary studies, is concerned not just with animal representation in literary texts, but also with animal rights." Unquote. So, Jew criticism is oriented towards heightening the reader's awareness and even towards inciting them to social and political action. It's a means of keeping the human community from destroying the non-human community, thus maintaining the ecological balance of the world. However, it is noticeable that Jew criticism, though directed towards a specific goal, preserves the aesthetic function of the literary text also. Now the question is, when Jew criticism emerged and why it emerged? Eco-criticism has generally shown little interest in non-human animals. In the first decade of the 21st century, therefore, Jew criticism has been inaugurated as a new critical discourse within eco-criticism as a means of challenging all kinds of violence done to animals and pain inflicted on them. In fact, a profound concern for all savage practices towards animals gives rise to this new field of criticism. So this is the theoretical part. Now I am going to discuss Arundhati Roy's the Ministry of Utmost Happiness and Jew criticism. Now, all of you know Arundhati Roy is one of a few novelists in the history of Indian English literature who may be said to be seriously concerned with ruthless destruction of animal community with the explosion of human population. The latest novel by Roy opposes the long Western tradition of human dominion over non-human community. It provides us with an ecological wisdom that we should change our anthropocentric attitudes into biocentric ones. Now I am going to analyze the text that is the Ministry of Utmost Happiness to substantiate my view. The novel is set in modernizing and industrializing Delhi, which has been depicted by Roy as an extremely polluted city having devastating effects on all the living beings of nature. It opens with a prologue, which clearly reveals the novelist's profound concern for endangered species of birds. Arundhati Roy here talks about, I quote, sparrows that have gone missing and the old white-backed vultures, custodians of the dead for more than 100 million years, that have been wiped out. Unquote. Now, according to Roy, the vultures have died of diclofenac poisoning. Admittedly, a major contributing factor in declining population of vultures is believed to be widespread use of drugs such as diclofenac. So, veterinary uses of diclofenac has been banned in India since 2006. Apart from diclofenac, aspirin, which is given to cattle as a muscle relaxant to ease pain and increase the production of milk, worked like nerve gas on white-backed vultures. Now, what is nerve gas? Nerve gas, if it is inhaled or when it is in contact with the skin, can paralyze the nervous system, which can lead to respiratory failure and immediate death. Then Roy has created two characters named Jaina and Saddam Hussein, who love animals and work for their preservation. Even in her very childhood, Zainab distinguished herself as a true worshipper of nature with all its creatures. Her real passion was animals. As Roy puts it, I quote, she wanted to feed all the half-boiled, half-dead white chickens that were pressed into filthy cages and stacked on top of each other outside the butcher shops to converse with every cat that passed across her path, and to take home every litter of stray puppies she found wallowing in the blood and offal flowing through the open drains. She would not listen when she was told that dogs were unclean nazis for Muslims and should not be touched. She did not shrink from the large bristly rats that hurried along the street she had to walk down every day. She could not seem to get used to the sight of the bundles of yellow chicken claws, sort of goat's trotters, the pyramids of goat's hairs with their staring, blind blue eyes, and the pearly white goat's brains that shivered like jelly in big steel bowls. Unquote. Roy even denounces the religious system as devoid of spirituality and devoted to ritualism and deprecates animal sacrifice. Zainab has a pet goat who survives 3 Bakra Eids unslaughtered. Another goat reared by Zainab survives a record 16 Bakra Eids unslaughtered and then dies of natural causes, that is colic, in Shahjahanabad. Obviously, the credit goes to Zainab's extreme fondness for animals. Here, Roy uncovers the falsehood and mendacity of the merciless ritual of animal sacrifice. When Zainab grows up and marries Saddam Hussein, they jointly work for the preservation of animals. The graveyard where they live together is turned into a little zoo, a Noah's Ark of injured animals. A young peacock who is unable to fly, 3 old cows, 3 dozen bush riggers, freed by Zainab from a bird seller, a small tortoise, a lame donkey, an old dog Biru, and several cats are given shelter by them. A Biru is a beagle who had either escaped from or outlived his purpose in a pharmaceutical testing lab. Roy seems to condemn the use of living animals in laboratories in the name of scientific experiments and inventions. Her depiction of Biru after being freed from the lab is really poignant. I quote, Biru, sometimes called Ruby, a dog Saddam had found wandering down the pavement of a busy road, wild-eyed and disoriented, with a maze of transparent tubes dangling out of him. He looked worn and rubbed out, like a drawing someone had tried to erase. I unquote. Moreover, Roy has delineated the dainty life of animals in Delhi Zoological Park. One day, Tilotoma or Tilo, one of the major characters in the novel, visits this zoo and witnesses the plight of the animals kept there. Roy has denounced the model development policy which often results in environmental degradation and oppression of non-human animals. In this novel, on a discussion, Tilo witnesses a curious scientific phenomenon. Let us recall such lines as, I quote, 2 bulls live in the service lane outside my flat. In the daytime, they appear quite normal, but at night, they grow tall. When they piss, they lift their legs like dogs. These days, one is never sure whether a bull is a dog or an ear of corn is actually a leg of pork or a beef stick. But perhaps this is the path of genuine modernity. Why, after all, shouldn't a glass be a hedgehog, a hedge and etiquette manual, and so on? I unquote. Moreover, Roy has drawn the reader's attention to the experiment in the poultry industry also. Tilo says, I'm quoting, I have learned that scientists working in the poultry industry are trying to exercise the mothering instinct in hens in order to mitigate or entirely remove their desire to brood. Their goal apparently is to stop chickens wasting time on unnecessary things and thereby to increase the efficiency of egg production. I unquote. Now, to conclude, I must say that Arundhati Roy, in her latest novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, has advocated the ecocentric philosophy of life instead of the reigning philosophies of Western civilization, which were deeply anthropocentric. That is, human beings were viewed as opposed to and superior to non-human animals and free to exploit them to meet their own needs. In fact, this novel is rich in the author's ecological wisdom. Roy's profound concern to create public awareness about environmental degradation and its negative impact on all the species of nature has been revealed in this novel. So thank you very much. I have referred to 3 books and an interview by Kathy Arlene Sokol. First of all, I have referred to Graham Coogan and Helen Tippett's book, Post-Colonial Eco-Criticism, Literature, Animals, Environment, published by Routledge in the year 2009. Secondly, I have referred to Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things, published by Penguin Random House India in the year 1997. And then I have referred to The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which is my prime concern. It is published by Penguin Random House India, published in 2017. And I have referred to an interview by Kathy Arlene Sokol entitled Like Sculpting Smoke, Arundhati Roy on Fame, Writing and India. It was published in Kyoto Journal on November 5, 2011. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Bipasa. If anyone has any question or any query. I think no one has any question. So, can you please tell us about the title? Why she has given this title as Utmost Happiness? Can you comment in few lines, please? Pasha?
Pardon, please?
Can you comment on the title about this, the Ministry of Utmost Happiness? What does she mean by this utmost happiness, about which she has talked about? Can you please say in few lines?
The Ministry of Utmost Happiness.
Yes.
Sorry, ma'am. I have not thought over this. Actually.
Okay, thank you, Bipasa ma'am. Now the next speaker, the next presenter is Makwana Ajay Lalabhai from Gitika. One minute. Is an assistant professor, Gita Krupa Society, Ghodasar, Ahmedabad. Over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Archana ma'am, for giving me this opportunity to share my views on my selected topic. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to talk about colorism in Toni Morrison's God Help the Child. In introduction, I would like to define what is African American literature. African American literature is an academic body of writing that refers to literature written by African descendants in the United States. African American literature has acquired the independent status in literary canon of world literature, which began with the writing of Phyllis Wheatley in late 18th century. African people were exported as slave laborers in different continents and colonies through Atlantic slave trade. They lived under the dominance of their white masters who were considering them as non-human. African American writers pretended their voice to overcome racism and slavery. These writers have treated the painful suffering, issues, and challenges of Black African community as the subjects of their writing. African American literature includes themes such as racism, slavery, social inequality, colorism, and segregation. Now we talk about literary portfolio of Toni Morrison. Born in Oahu, United States, Collie Anthony Wofford Morrison, popularly known as Toni Morrison, was a prolific Nobel Prize-winning African-American novelist, essayist, short story writer, editor, and teaching faculty. She completed her bachelor degree with major English in 1953 from Harvard University. Later on, she joined Cornell University for her master degree in 1955 under the subject American Literature. She earned many prestigious awards like National Books Critics Circle Award, Pulitzer Prize, and American Book Award for her splendid works. In 1993, she has been rewarded by Nobel Prize for essays Playing in the Dark, Whiteness, and the Literary Imagination. She received highest civilian award in 2012 by US President Barack Obama. Morrison creatively portrayed poignant and painful suffering of African community in her fictional works. Morrison's works are preoccupied with racism, color conflict, segregation, inequality, and slavery. Morrison played a vital role in bringing African American literature into mainstream at global level. She opened a new arena and dimensions in African American writing. Morrison's major novels include The Bluest Eye, published in 1970, Sula, 1973, Song of Solomon, 1977, Tar Baby, 1981, Beloved, 1987, and God Help the Child, 2015. Now I'm going to explore how colorism is being represented in God Help the Child. In Western society, along with race, color also equally matters. Racial segregation based on race and color has been existed in many parts of the world. Conceptually, the term colorism was coined and practiced by renowned African American writer Alice Walker in the year of 1982. She invented the term colorism to denote the superiority of white or light skin over black. White was superior in every aspect than black. White people strongly ignored the existence of black due to their class, race, and color and considered them as inferior and non-human. Toni Morrison's God Help the Child profoundly deals with racism, colorism, and child abuse. Lula Ann, also known as Bride in the novel, she is a female child terribly faces the issue of color conflict in her childhood period. Lula's parents were having a privilege of lighter skin in white American society. They were curiously expecting their first child to have a same body color. However, their strong fantasy regarding having lighter skin baby collapsed with the birth of Anne. Anne born with dark black color looking different than her parents. Sweetness and Louise received traumatic shock after seeing their newborn baby. Sweetness compares her child's blackness with Sudanese black people. She clearly blames on her husband regarding the blackness of their baby. She states that her blackness has been inherited from her husband's family, not hers.
She says, quote, "It's not my fault, so you can't blame me. I didn't do it, and I have no idea how it happened. It didn't take more than an hour after they pulled her out from between my legs to realize something was wrong, really wrong. She was so black, scared me. Midnight black, Sudanese black. I am light skinned with good hair, what we call high yellow, and so is Lula Ann's father. Similarly, Lula's father becomes also frustrated internally and strongly rejects from accepting Anne as his baby. He considers Lula more than an enemy to him. He does not even touch to her body. In state of disgust, he breaks their marriage life and leaves both Sweetness and Lula forever. He ruthlessly imposed the responsibility of Lula on his wife. Sweetness narrates, quote, "He wasn't a Cushing man, she when he said, 'God man, what the hell is this?' I knew we were in trouble. That's what did it. What caused the fights between me and him? It broke our marriage to pieces. We had 3 good years together, but when she was born, he blamed me and treated Lula and like she was a stranger, more than that, an enemy." Unquote. Again, Sweetness says, quote, "He never touched her. I never did convince him that I aunt never ever fooled around with another man. He was dead sure I was lying. We argued and argued till I told her blackness must be from his own family, not mine. That's when it get worse. So he bade he just up and left, and I had to look after for another cheaper place to live. However, Sweetness endures the responsibility of Lula with many restrictions. She too rarely touches Lula's body. Sweetness feels extremely embarrassed to have a dark skinned baby. To protect her social image at outside, Sweetness advises her daughter Lula not to call her mother or mama publicly. She suggests Lula to call her as Sweetness. Sweetness condemns negatively the physical appearance of Lula by comparing with which, quote, "I told her to call me Sweetness instead of mother or mama. It was safer. Being dead black and having what I think are two thick lips, calling me mama, would confuse people. Besides, she has funny colored eyes, crow black with a blue tint, something witchy about them too." Morrison directs her community to show that the issue regarding racism and colorism are divisive within their community too. Bride's mother, Sweetness, develops the ideology of white people to measure people from color of body. She measures the human through the lens of color. A small child who is not aware from the parameters of beauty receives ill treatment from her own parents. She also don't know her dark blue black color will remain as cross in her life. She faces many complexities from external world. The conflict of dark skin over lighter skin pressurized mostly to Bride. Bride does not get the love and affection of motherhood because of her dark color. Thus, Bride brutally encounters several prejudices on the racial ground. I would like to conclude with punchline. White cannot be an epitome of beauty. Black can be prettier. People having dark skin have also equal rights to live with same equality and dignity as the normal people live. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Uh, Thank you, Makawana. It was a well presented paper. If anyone has any question or any observation, no one has any question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so
Yes.
thank you once again. The next presenter is Benjamin Karam. Is a PhD scholar, Department of English, Tezpur University, Assam. And his topic is Changing Ethos of the Modern Anthology, Regional Poetry and the Modern Indian Canon. So over to Benjamin.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'll be sharing my slide from now on.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Please bear with me a moment. Okay, can everyone see this?
No, it is not visible so far. Are you sharing the PPT? Yeah, now it is coming. Now it is visible. Now you can.
Okay, okay. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, my paper is titled Changing Ethos of the Modern Anthology, Regional Poetry and Modern Indian Canon. I'll be talking about anthologies in general. What are they? What are the politics that go behind the creation of anthologies? And secondly, I'll talk a little bit about how anthologies help or shape canons. You know, how they consolidate text into the creation of national canons and all those things. And finally, I'll make a brief discussion about how regional poetry and the conflict between regional poetry and national canons are reflected in the pages of anthologies. So let me go on. Anthologies have consistently served a pivotal role in the making and unmaking of literary taste and the modern literary canon. During the 20th century, the anthology moved from being a space for collection into a space for consolidation, not just for text, but of ideas. Institutional contexts, including publishers, the marketplace, classrooms, editorial ambition, cultures, and national languages, have all played a part in shaping the modern anthology. It is one of the few mediums that mediates between the academic world and non-academic readers, and therefore is responsible for taking certain ideas into the public domain. The anthology and its editing practices is often tied to the formation of national canons. The inclusion and exclusion of text creates a literary narrative, as Bennett Anderson observes in Imagined Communities, that all nations in a modern era are constituted by fiction of their identities, which are in perpetual negotiation. Within these boundaries, the modern anthology reports the struggle for an emergent literary entity and the conditions under which that entity is represented and archived. The discontents often found in the criticism of anthologies and the national canons they try to create also corresponds to Berman and Wood's argument that nationhood is a never-ending conflictual process driven by changing cultural practices. What we now understand as anxiety of anthology making, therefore, is something new that developed during the 20th century modes of archiving, where the relationship between text, chronology, and ideology is enforced or encouraged. Within the modern anthology, the anthologist conceives boundaries both conceptually and temporally. The poetry chosen thus become not just an aesthetic piece, but an agent in a narrative. For the modern anthology, the act of inclusion or exclusion becomes an act of assertion, an act of making a particular type of argument about the cultural validity of works of art. It is within this politics of anthology making that the challenges of democratically archiving the plurality of cultural texts have emerged. And through it, the tensions between the accepted canon and the omitted regional texts have also emerged as a form of discontent. The dominant anthologies of the 20th century are sponsored by academic institutions and academic publishers. In India, the project of creating self-affirming literary identity within the anthology enterprise began in the 1950s with titles such as Modern Indian Poetry and Modern Indo-Anglo Poetry published in 1958 and 1959 respectively. Between 1950 and 2020, more than 200 anthologies of Indian poetry in English were published. In the pages of these anthologies, the construction of modernity itself became a narrative. In the introduction to the Oxford India Anthology of 12 Modern Indian Poets, edited by Arun Krishna Malhotra, the editor states that the origins of modern Indian poetry in English go no further back than the poets in this anthology. What we now understand as de facto canonical poets of modern Indian poetry all appear in Malhotra's 1992 anthology and A.K. Ramanujan's 1994 anthology, both published by the Oxford University Press. The engagement of Oxford University Press in the canon creation project can be understood from the number of anthologies they have published since the 1970s. On this list, you can see since 1972 till 2010 the changing interest of Oxford Anthology, Oxford University Press, and the anthologies that they have published. And here in this graph that I've shown, you can see how the publication of anthologies just skyrocketed from 1950s till the 1970s. And then the canon formation took place somewhere around here between 1980s and 1990s during the canon war. And since then, major publishers have again invested a lot in the publication of anthologies. We are here now. This is just this 10 years. But in 2029, I don't know how far this graph is going to go up. Original poetry from places like Kashmir and Northeast have long been guarded from the pages of mainstream national anthologies for reasons which could both be ideological and political in nature. Mainstream anthologies and their exclusion of the original is also a form of political education, as Marianne Moore observes, omissions are not accidents. The anxiety of being Indian that poets from Kashmir and the Northeast experience is an anxiety based not merely on language, but one that is rooted in its soil. However, growing sense of liberal ideology and political correctness among the most active readership demography has directly affected major publishers and their willingness to venture into more enterprising terrains. The publication of Dancing Earth, an anthology of poetry from Northeast India by Penguin Books, and the Oxford Anthology of Writing from Northeast India, 2010, published by Oxford University Press, shows the changing attitude of major publishing houses and how the political milieu have tremendously changed modern anthologies. In more recent anthologies, such as the HarperCollins Book of English Poetry, 100 Great Indian Poems, edited by Abheki, and Modern Indian Poetry by Younger Indians, which was published by Sahitya Academy, the shift in attitude towards more open and inclusive attempt at revising the identity of modern Indian poetry is visible. The Modern Poetry Anthology exists as the outcome of rapid acculturation and shared nervousness of a connected generation. It has become a forum of the present, by the present, and for the present. In recent years, the revision undertaken by university towards more democratic and inclusive curriculum is also pushing the expansion of modern Indian canon. The recent Delhi University in English, introduced in 2013, meticulously contains the work of 4 poets: Henry Louis Desrosiers, Nissim Ezekiel, Kamala Das, and Robin Ngamo. Although each poet is accompanied with only 2 poems, in terms of matrix, they are each representing 25% of poetic canon in an undergraduate anthology that is read by thousands of students each semester. Thus, the inclusion of Ngamo in a university anthology designed to cover 200 years of Indian literature is significant for original poetry. The establishment of Sahitya Academy in 1954 has also helped in recognizing and giving exposure to the poetic languages of the many cultures of the subcontinent through their frequent publication of poetry anthologies. In conclusion, since the early 1950s, each anthology has become increasingly attached towards the creation of a national narrative, and there is a tendency for literary canon to become extremely hegemonic once solidified. The construction of a national canon demands a meticulous assessment of the literature of its people. Since anthologies act as archival spaces, it is necessary to continually examine the canons they create against the backdrop of political culture. What is required now is not a complete condemnation of the existing canon, but to constantly challenge canon to create a dialogue. It is only through these exchanges in the pages of future anthologies that a healthy and transparent idea of Royal Indian poetry may be seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin Karam, for your nice deliberation on changing ethos of the modern anthology. If anyone has any observation or
Thank
any
you.
question or any query, you can put. Okay, I think there is no any question. So thank you once again, Benjamin. Now we
Yeah.
have the next presenter. I think there are three
Oh,
people.
thank you.
Mr. Tushar, assistant professor, and then thank you. Now I would like to
Hi,
call
good evening.
upon
Yeah.
the next presenter. I think Mr. Tushar is there, and he's the assistant professor of Center for Languages and Communication, SGT, University Gurugram. There are two other participant or presenter, Miss Monica Sharma and Miss Arvinder Kaul Pavla. But I think Mr. Tushar will present his paper. So over to Mr. Tushar. And his topic is, their topic is Dalit Assortment, the many shades of Dalits. Over to Tushar.
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am, for giving me such opportunity. I'm just sharing my screen. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay.
Your screen is visible. You can start
Yeah,
now.
can I present? Yeah.
Yeah, you can present.
Okay. Thank you. A very good evening to one and all present here. So the title of our topic is Dalit Assortment, the Many Shades of Dalit. I'm Tushar from SGT University, and along with me there are two more contributors, Ms. Avinda Kaur Pavla and Ms. Monica Sharma. So before just explaining the topic, I just want to give you the introduction, like what it is all about. And for that, I would like to quote this particular line from Yashwant Manohar, like, tell me how to live if it at each moment one dies. I feel foreigner among the people, bearing my burden of such a bastard life. So my paper is maybe, or a paper is maybe based on this particular quote that is just I'm quoted from Yashwant Manohar's line. So the flow of my paper or the flow of the presentation is like this. The research paper is an attempt to showcase the types of Dalits and their conditions in different strata of the society. I'll be talking about on the three major topics: Dalitness, categories, and different shades of Dalits. So talking about the central idea of a paper, like again, I just want to quote the second quotation from Kadubhai Kharat. No clothes to wear, neither food to eat. It was a huge fuzzy, a child in arms, broom in hands, a pot full of shit on head. My beam has filled my sack with gold. This statement has enunciated the unaccepted but still known conditions of Dalits. However, the condition or the contradiction with the dialogue, there are many categories which are yet to be identified and examined scrupulously, which led us to the conclusion that there is a plenty of possibilities which are yet to be included while discussing Dalits of our country. Because of the difference between truism and post-story life, there's a difference in the image of a Dalit across the country. The term Dalit is taken from the Sanskrit language with root dal, which means split, break, crack, or crushed. Proclaim crushed, and unfortunately, these are also the proclaimed features of Dalits, especially in India. From the book Suraj Jangre 2019, Caste Matters, he attempts to contextualize the lived experiences of Dalit. The narrative talks about Dalit politics in present and also interrogates the various possible positions that they have adopted towards their present problems, based on how the Dalits respond, varying from either adaptation to a position of Brahmanism. My further, I want to talk about the types of Dalit. So there are basically four major types of Dalit: empirical Dalits. Under empirical, there are conservative and reactive. Elite Dalits. Under elite Dalits, there are salaried hypocrites and third generation Dalits. Self-obsessed Dalit, which we can also term as harmful Dalit. And the last one is the radical Dalits. Not only are these shades fuzzy in nature, but as Yangde notes as well, these can also be found in any category of people and need not to be limited the Dalits alone. So just the first type of Dalit, or we can say as the token Dalit, we have the four characteristics we have given are given in the presentation. The Dalits who emphasize their allegiance to the Congress Hindu agenda presented themselves as an integrated part of Hindu culture. They even contested against Ambedkar and were even successful in its negotiation with the British. This class of Dalits successfully betrayed Ambedkar's goal and represent the best of tokenism of the community they claimed as their own. Even though Kashi Ram picked a special term for this particular group of Dalit, the Chamchas, we can say, because they had not direct power and were not able to operate on their own. Therefore, it was through Chamchas that their operators attacked Dalits. I just want to read out the characteristics. Like first, Ambedkar experienced this category of Dalit in his political and social career. The second one is we can consider them as the Chamcha age. The third one is like the even though Kashiram has also identified them and given a particular line or statement about them, what he has actually mentioned is the Dalits who hope to gain from sabotaging the Dalit political discourse by enslaving their need over the community. Further, the conservative Dalits, again, there are certain characteristics given about this particular kinds of Dalits. They can be found in every religion. They do have faith in karmic theory. They are the educated ones. Conservative Dalits prefer to run the world based on their principles, which are not pluralistic. Their method is the only method for Dalit liberation. There's this question mark, like it can be possible because they do think about, yes, this is the only method for Dalit liberation, and the final is Dalit love. To explain conservative Dalits, they do prefer to stay in confined space and operate within a regressive worldview. They use religion to dominate and suppress the dissenting voice amongst the Dalit radical. Their enduring faith in karmic theory pushes them to be the regular visitor to Hindu congregation of Babas and Sadhvi to seek guidance for the next life. Many among the conservative Dalits have graduated among the ranks of top leaders in various fields. Due to their education and upwardly mobile background, they have flanked a new class of educated Dalits who are neither radical nor submissive. The ideas of Dalit liberation are not practiced in the private sphere. Their daughters do not have the desired independence. They treat women as secondary to men and expect them to submit to patriarchy. The extended family compel the female child to pursue a life of subordination. Further, we have reactive Dalits. To explain reactive Dalits, there are certain characteristics, or just to explain reactive Dalits, like they don't have any ideology or program to offer. They do ride on the principles of negating others. Their victory is laden with the destructions of others. They can be termed as a first class servant, a second class citizen, and a third class individual. The reactives profoundly invested in gaining legitimacy from the Dalit community in order to attract their dominant caste matters attention. They are the reserved foot soldiers who are ready to sacrifice their community's priority for a slice of the leftovers. They wag their tails as per their master's wishes. They utilize them by repeating the master's generosity, time, and again they click pictures with the local leaders and superior party women and proudly display themselves as loyal servants. They're not concerned about their autonomy and their role as equal partners in the democratic game. They are relegated to the position of a first class servant, a second class citizen, and a third class individual. Next, we have elite Dalits, the most ungrateful class of Dalits, and it benefits the most from the Dalit caste identity struggle. This class of Dalit can be found in politics, public and private sector of jobs, and in the field of arts and culture. And their main aim, or we can say they desire to claim the upper class status. The term elite Dalit might sound misplaced, but in this quest to attain elitism amongst the Dalit, there is a desire to claim upper class status. It is a desperate attempt to replicate upper caste classness in Dalit social circle. The number of elite Dalits are nowhere close to the relative size of the dominant caste. However, they validates their status from the majority of the poor oppressed Dalits. It is in relation to the lower caste Dalit that the elite Dalits draw their powers in order to execute their wishes upon poor Dalits. They have a different vision of reality. They prefer to work within a system that continues to oppress Dalits instead of working towards challenging and eventually dismantling the apparatus that adversely affects their work. Then we have salaried hypocrites, or we can say the third generation Dalit. There are two different, these are two different terms, salaried hypocrites and third generation Dalits. To describe these two, salaried hypocrites are one of the finest example of helpless, pitiable creatures. These highly talented people with amazing abilities and hard work now see themselves trapped in alienating caste system. It is not that they never knew caste or did not bear the brunt of it, but they have never imagined that they would not escape its shackles. They got called names deriding their caste and are put under pressure by their superiors. And of course, these superiors were the non Dalits. The second is the third generation Dalits. These kind of Dalits or this class of Dalits, they mostly inherit their parents' lifestyle, approach, practices, and attitudes towards the society. Very often, educated parents with salaried jobs and balanced lifestyles expose their children to the issues of caste as an economic policies. The third generation Dalits are class sensitive and caste blind. Due to this, they submit to the class structures in society as being the model of development for Dalit. The next kind of Dalit, we have self-obsessed Dalit or the harmful Dalit. Certain Dalits have a dual stand on reservation policies in India. They believe their measure of success comes from individual-centered achievements. Many educated Dalits who start off as liberal by standing guard to protect their rights turn to conservative values as soon as they get accepted in mainstream Brahminical market, which advocates for the reduction of state intervention in public policies. Just to explain the self-obsessed Dalit, I want to quote one example from the book Caste Matters. Any Dalit who goes up the self-obsessed Dalit for advice or help is schooled on how to distance oneself from the lovely Dalit status and shouted at for claiming the Dalit identity. A Dalit PhD student in an elite university in the US benefited from his elite Dalit networks. His statement of purpose and letter of recommendation benefited from counseling by a fellow Dalit who had completed his PhD from an Ivy League school. The student never invested in nurturing the next generation of Dalits who solicited his advice. He once told that the Dalit students who asked for guidance were lazy and untrustworthy. They keep asking me for advice they would not follow, so I gave up on guiding anybody. They want everything on a platter. The next kind of Dalit or the next type of Dalit we have is radical Dalits. This category can be found in any class or subcaste of Dalits. These Dalits could be poor, middle class, or rich. Their reactive sense is out of an urgency to place themselves in defense against any attack on their caste folk. They are very proud of their caste and Dalitness. They are different from the token category discussed earlier. Radical Dalits are committed to their struggle and are radicalized in process of realizing their sense of being. They love their people and hate the oppressor. They have experienced caste hatred firsthand and hateful of such a system. They know the tactics of dominant caste. Thus, they stand guard against the oppression that they practice. Radical Dalits keep their identity close to their hearts and want to engage with it actively. They do not shy away from the caste. In fact, they hold it up as a primary locus of understanding the world. To conclude my PPT, I just want to give the conclusion of my overall PPT. The objective of this paper or this presentation is to identify the classification of Dalit community and how they are justified. There are many categories or shades which are yet to be identified and examined scrupulously, which led us to the conclusion that there is plenty of possibilities which are yet to be included while discussing Dalits of a country. This paper presents different situations of a Dalit while going through this journey of casteism in India. It can be beneficial as well as can create problem for Dalits, as earlier people were aware of this term Dalit as the fifth Varna of Hindu religion. But I'm sure after reading this paper or after going through this presentation, you guys have the idea or the experience like there are multiple shades of Dalit and we can have the various other images of Dalit existence. Thank you so much. I'm done with my presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Tusa. Wonderfully, it was a very wonderful presentation. You talked about what is Dalit and what is Dalitness and different types of Dalits. So, if anyone has any observation or any question,
Ma'am, I have one. Can I ask you?
okay.
Can I ask the presenter?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
I think that a lot of observations that have been captured in this paper come straight from a book called Caste Matters by
Caste
Suraj
matters,
Yengde.
yes.
Yeah, Suraj Yengde. So I do not see the originality in this work. I see a lot of repetition because you have you have not even bothered to change the point of view, and you speak from the point of view of Suraj Yengde. Who goes on to talk about the PhD students in US and so on and so forth. In fact, he uses multiple anecdotes. And I think it's a disservice to the community of scholars if this kind of practice is being done, and especially in a conference where you straight away pick up someone's point of view and begin to talk from that point of view. I really want your clarification here.
Yeah. Can I just say something to
Yes,
what
please.
Abhinav Piyush just mentioned?
Yes.
Yeah, because see, I've already mentioned this thing that I'm referring to Suraj Yengde's book Caste Matters, right? And
Right.
my contribution regarding this presentation is to uh, just give the audience and just because see being a scholar we do have subscription towards this book and other paper like caste matters and types of dalits, but my contribution like being a dalit we do know yes there are multiple categories and multiple shades of dalit, but to make it understand because see being a non-dalit you cannot understand these shades of dalit which is actually presented by Suraj Yengde in his book, right? And so
I,
my
I have I have I have a
observation.
I have a big difference here, because I don't think Suraj Yengde is interested in just writing from the point of view of a Dalit, or as a scholar, I think nobody owns a knowledge point. No one owns a position of knowledge, and it seems that this is also a disservice to the brilliant book that has been written by Suraj Yengde. And I'm sure those of us who have studied Suraj Yengde are kind of appalled the way he's just being summarized here. So please have respect for the scholarship. Please have respect for the original ideas. And I think I will submit it to the chair. Thank you so much.
I also have a question.
Yeah.
Don't we find these sort of shades in other community people also?
Yeah, there can be multiple shades. See, again, because I know Dalits, because being a Dalit, you do have the basic roots attached to you, right? So yes, there can be multiple shades. There can be different shades in other community as well as in other religion as well. But like I'm not aware of that particular community and I'm not aware of other religions, so I cannot just comment. But yes, there can be multiple shades in other religion and other community as well.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but then what was the
Yeah.
real, what was the objective, or you can say motive behind showing the multiple threads or multiple, multiple faces of Dalits particularly?
See, being a scholar or being just you can say just a common person or being a normal Hindu, we know just one term of Dalit, like the Dalit one or the oppressor one, like oppressed by the community, oppressed by the non-Dalits, oppressed by the upper caste people, right? But while summarizing the points that I've just quoted in my presentation, I just want to give, or I just want to give a different perspective of Dalits as well. Like there is no, there are other way of Dalit, or there are other shades of Dalit. Now a Dalit is not only oppressed by the upper class. There are people, there are a different class as well, like the elite class. The elite class also oppressed, even though the Dalit people, right? There are class called radical Dalits. These radical Dalits are proud of their caste. Like they don't want to change, or they don't want to attain that elitism in their class or in their caste. So earlier, like before reading this particular work or before reading any particular paper about Dalit, we just know Dalit as a community that is suppressed by the upper caste people. But when you read this particular book, when you read this particular uh, work by Suraj Ingade, you can have multiple shades. Like yes, there are other shades of Dalits as well. There are other, you can say, point of view of Dalits as well.
Uh,
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tushar. As we are, I think we are waiting for valedictory functions, so we have to uh,
Thank
sort
you
these
so much, ma'am.
questions. And thank you for the observation, Mr. Abhinav Piyush and Deepak Abi. So, and thank you, Mr. Tushar also. Now, I will like to call upon the next presenter, M.R. Ashlin from NMCC Marthandam, Kanyakumari, and her topic is Maternal Deprivation and Destruction, a syndromic study of Gillian Flyn's sharp objects. Over to Ashley.
Thank you, sir. Respected chairperson and the participants present here, a warm good evening to all. I thank the organizer for providing me a wonderful opportunity to present a paper in this international center. My topic is Maternal Deprivation and Destruction, a syndromic study of Gillian Flynn's sharp objects. This is the title of the paper I am going to present. Some women aren't made to be mothers, and some women aren't made to be daughters. This is a prominent line in the novel Sharp Objects. As we know, in this present world, parenting plays a great role in knowledge and in maternal instinct. It's not a magical switch that immediately turns on after giving birth to a baby. As I stated in the quote, all women cannot be a perfect mother. There are mothers who compete, ignore, and abuse their children. Mothers from healthy families genetically develop the emotional bond between themselves and their children. While the daughters from unhealthy families or the daughters from unloving mothers have dreadful role models, and they treat their children in the same way how their mother treated them. They lack empathy, and their strong egocentric behavior blinds them to the suffering they create to their children. So, as we all know, that seeking attention from others is a quest of a human being. We might come across our co-workers or some students who pretends like sick to get some sympathy, care, or attention from others. In the same way, some mothers use their children as tools to gain some sort of care and attention from others. To seek this kindness from others, this type of mothers grieve about their children by presenting us as they are suffering from some serious illness like cancer, miscarriages, etc. Sharp Objects is a novel by an American psychological novelist, William Klein. The novel mainly deals with the current or the modern parenting issues we experience in our day-to-day life. This is a novel which exposes the inner psyche of a mother who tries to seek attention and sympathy by making her children sick. Adora is the antagonist of the novel, and she's a victim of parental abuse. As the meaning of the name Adora suggests to be loved, she liked to be adored by others. On the contrary, Adora's mother, Joya, she's cruel, dominant, and very weird towards her children. She never treats Adora in a loving way. The maltreatments and abuses she received from her mother affects her mental health. As a result, she tries some coping mechanisms that helps her to earn love and attention from others. To receive attention from others, she shows herself as ill, and she always carries some medicines with her. By playing sick, she gained sympathy, care, and attention from the people around her. And when Adora becomes adult, she is more addicted towards the adoration, and she craves for more attention. So Adora tries to find a solid sense of herself and her place in the world. To relax her fears and anxieties, Adora navigates herself to the world of motherhood. Adora unwittingly became pregnant at the age of 17 out of wedlock to a boy from Kentucky. She meets him at church during Christmas camp, and he never returns back. Adora thought that she can win Joya's, her mother's affection and care after the child's birth. But the news of pregnancy out of wedlock brings more hatred of her mother towards Adora. Adora continues to feel worthless, unlovable, and inadequate. Adora, who fakes illness on herself to gain attention and sympathy from others during her childhood, now she induces sickness on her daughters. Psychologists identify this inner state of mind as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is a syndrome in which the caretaker of a child either fakes symptoms or causes real symptoms to make it appear like the child is ill. This is the definition given by India Today magazine. Adora induces sickness on her daughters by feeding toxic pills and homemade solutions. She grieves over her sick children, and she enjoys the attention and sympathy shown by others. She also enjoys the dependency of her children after they getting sick. This destructive syndrome distracts the overall development of the three daughters, Camille, Marian, and Amma. Camille is the first child born out of wedlock for Adora. When Adora tries to feed pills and solutions to Camille, she shows much resistance towards the medicines, because the medicines makes her sicker than before. So Camille is resistant towards these medicines can't help Adora to gain her desired attention from others. This bridges a huge gap between Camille and Adora. Camille entirely lost the attention of her mother, and Adora's maternal deprivation towards Camille affects her psychologically, and also it affects her ability to build a healthy relationship among her family members, her friends, and also to her siblings. As you know, every child has an intense desire to be adored and nurtured. Lack of maternal care and the love she is denied from her mother makes her feeling unlovable. Unable to find the reasons for her mother's rejection, she moves to Chicago and drowns herself in alcohol and some self-harming activities. As Adora can't get the desired attention from Emily, she married Alan and gave birth to her second daughter, Marian. Unlike Emily, Marian is so easy to feed, and Marian is affected by a series of illness from her infancy. Adora's toxic pills and the solutions make Marian sicker than before. Adora enjoys the compliments given by others for taking good care of Marian. When Marian is admitted in the hospital, Dr. Jameson compliments Adora for taking good care of Marian. In her diary entries, she wrote like this: he seems quite impressed with me, said that I was an angel and that every child should have a mother like me. So, to get this sort of compliments, to get more compliments and attention from others, she continued to poison Marian in the guise of concern without the knowledge of others. The toxic medicines given by Adora took away the life of Marian at the age of 9. After Marian's death, people became so kind to Adora for her loss. She enjoys the attention and care given by others, but the thirst for attention doesn't came to an end. After Marian's death, Adora gave birth to her third daughter, Amma. Amma is so smart and highly manipulative. Like Adora, Amma likes to be adored, and Amma's pathological need for love allows Adora to induce sickness on her. She let her mother feed poisonous pills, and in return, Amma demands her mother's unconcealed love and devotion. Amma victimized herself in the process of pleasing her mother. Although she knows it doesn't create a genuine bond between her mother and her, she believes that it yields her a kind of attention and care from her mother. Amma is so jealous and she doesn't like anyone getting more attention than her from her loved ones. Amma brutally killed her schoolmates Anne and Natalie for getting more attention from her mother. She also killed her classmate Lily Burke for gaining more attention from her half-sister Emily. Adora's destructive parental care and the syndrome turns Amma into a psycho killer. Thus, Adora's maternal deprivation and destruction and the destructive syndrome harm the children physically, psychologically, and emotionally. Many children suffer from these kinds of parenting. So mothers should identify their true self and avoid the pitfalls of self-images, relationships, and fantasies that destabilize their psychological well-being. Children who are struggling with abusive parents should take healthy decisions to rebuild their life. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Anselin. Thank you for your deliberation on maternal deprivation and destruction and MSBP syndrome. It was a very nice presentation and deliberation. So thank you very much. If anyone has any question or any query. I think no one has any questions. So now there is a last presenter, S. Geeta Nirmal. Thank you, Anselin.
Thank you.
Okay, so now I would like to call upon S. Geeta Nirmal from Nizamoni Memorial Christian College, Marthandam, Tamil Nadu. and the topic is dissociation and dissolution of insulated self, a study of a Quay Armand's Why Are We So Blessed? Geeta Nirmal? Is he there?
I think Geeta Nirmal is not
Okay,
available
so,
right now, ma'am.
okay, then we have concluded this technical sessions. So thank you very much.
Okay.